And we are back, and we're getting pretty close to next week when Alabama will depart for the game we're all waiting for, the Rose Bowl game between the Tide and Michigan. Mark Schipper has been with us a number of times. This is we talked to him when he was touring the country. He wrote a book. This is a program from 1927, Stanford in Alabama. There's such great history. It's in the Alabama fight song. Remember the Rose Bowl team? It's indelible. The stories about taking the train across the country. Mark, it's been too long. Good afternoon. Thanks for popping back with us. And how are you?
Paul, great to be back. I'm doing great. I love this topic, and I love the history because I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with how deep this goes with Alabama, the South, and the Rose Bowl.
Yeah, let's give a tutorial. I've heard it from people who were there, and this was at the beginning of my career. It's kind of hard to find too many now, but it is, especially for Alabama. But I mean, the Rose Bowl itself it does speak for itself. But catch us up on, I don't know, about 100 years of tradition. But going back to the 20s, when Alabama first made that jaunt to what was and still is, the ultimate game.
Yeah, I think the first Rose Bowl was played in 1902. It went on a short hiatus. It wasn't popular enough. Michigan blew out Stanford, and the Rose Bowl parade went back to ostrich racing for a few years to entertain the people. But by 1916, they got back into football. The game started back up, and I think what people should know is, as you were saying, an older generation remembers this, but for anyone who's been around since 1946 to today, the Rose Bowl has been known as a Big Ten versus Pac-12 game, Pacific Conference game. But from 1916 to 1945, it was a wide-open game. It started out being called the Tournament East versus West game, and it pitted the Western champion versus the best team in the United States. And for those years, it was essentially a de facto national title game. Whoever won the Rose Bowl won the national championship.
It's interesting because in all the years I've covered college football, I thought the Rose Bowl maybe got too much credit, but I forgot how it really began. So and I think the setting does speak for itself. So when did all this start to change?
Well, it changed right after World War II. The Big Ten and what was called the Pacific Coast Conference, then it's the modern Pac-12. It's interesting. History repeats itself. The PCC would later dissolve. So this is actually the second time the Pacific Conference has dissolved. But in 46, they signed a contract with the Big Ten. The champions of each of those conferences would play exclusively in the Rose Bowl game. And that's when we got from 46 to basically 1998 when the BCS arrived. We had the Big Ten Pacific Conference champion game. But prior to that, it was the Pacific Conference champion versus the best team in the country, and it didn't really matter. The game actually started out being called the Tournament East-West game. You'll notice the South was left off of that. So part of the significance of Alabama going in 1925-26, they were the first Southern team to play in the Rose Bowl, and it was a huge event because up to that point, Southern football was not considered up to snuff with the rest of the country. So Alabama went out there with the South behind it on a mission to vindicate Southern football, which is why, of course, it's in Alabama's fight song. It was the making of Alabama football.
And Mark, I think it's also worth pointing out, I want you to expound on this. Today, the Rose Bowl is very important. It's iconic. But we all know that the number one sport in the country nationally is the NFL. But if you go back to this period of time, is it fair to say that college football really trumped almost everything else?
Oh, yeah. The NFL did not start overtaking college football until the middle 60s. Really, the Super Bowl era, 67, is sort of when the NFL took over. The AFL, the NFL merged. The Super Bowl became the big game. But prior to that, college football was the colossus of football in the country, and the Rose Bowl was, for many years, the only bowl game, and then for many years after that, by far the biggest. I mean, it was the most attended by 30,000 people, the biggest payout, the most watched on TV. The Rose Bowl sort of sat at the top, and all the other bowls direct copies of the Rose Bowl came after that. So, yeah, the NFL didn't get past college football until the 60s.
And Mark, I'll let you do the answering, but I'm leaning on my own feeble memory. But if you go back to the mid to late 60s, there were only a handful of bowl games, and on New Year's Day, I mean, you literally it was the biggest day of the year. You waited for whatever game started first, the Cotton Bowl or the Sugar Bowl or however it was done, and there were only a handful of games. So every game mattered in such a magnificent and magnanimous way.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. These games started at the Rose Bowl and other first. The Rose Bowl was the first nationally broadcast championship football game in the country. In the 30s, the other major bowls came along: the Orange Bowl, the Cotton Bowl, the Sugar Bowl, and those 4 bowl games, they were all on TV by the mid 50s when TV got cranked up after the war. And New Year's Day was the high holiday. You basically played back to back football games, 4 straight college bowl games, and that was the number one football day of the year. So I was, I'm not old enough to have experienced just those 4 bowl games, but I can even remember in the 1990s when I was a kid, there were like 18 bowl games. All of them were very important. And New Year's Day essentially was still just those games, plus you throw in the Fiesta Bowl. So those early bowl games are the reason why they get the status that they get and why they're considered first for the postseason is because they are the making of the college football postseason. They are what the postseason always has been.
Mark, I can remember as a kid, there was occasionally you would see 2 at one time. Could have been the Cotton and the Sugar. I'm pretty sure that was because the Orange was always at night and the Rose led into it. So there were 4 going on.
Yeah.
There were 4 one day. I think 3 on probably NBC. The Cotton may have been elsewhere on CBS. And I was at one of my friend's house. I mean, we were 8 or 9 years old. So we had the main TV, and his father wheeled in the portable TV, and we literally watched 2 games at one time.
Yeah, well, that's how you knew it was a big day in the old days when you were wheeling in the portable. That's when it was a big day of football.
What always bugged me about the Orange Bowl, because Christmas break ended January 2nd. You had to go back to school. And I'm like fighting with my mother about staying up and watching. It was the Big 8. Who was in the Orange Bowl? It was the Big 8. I'm trying to remember.
It was the Big 8 champ versus usually an independent team
okay.
or some alternative selection.
So you always had Oklahoma, Nebraska, something like that, or versus somebody. And what's the deal on Notre Dame? Notre Dame didn't go to bowl games for a long time, did they?
Oh, no, not for a long time. Interestingly enough, it all goes back to the Rose Bowl. Newt Rockne's 4 Horsemen team played in the 24-25 Rose Bowl the year before Alabama went out. And then Notre Dame did not play in another bowl game until 1969. They played in the Cotton Bowl. And that's part of the reason they did that, Paul, is because in those days they named a national championship before the postseason.
Right.
It was a regular season sport. So once the regular season was over and a national champion was named, Notre Dame had their different alternative ideas about how long you should be playing football. And they said, listen, when the regular season's over, we're done.
Mark, in fact, Saturday night I was in Birmingham hosting a banquet that honored the last team to win a national. This wasn't the reason. They were the first team, first desegregated team to win a national championship. But this team that was being honored was the 73 Alabama team, was the last team to win a national championship before they changed the rule because they ended up losing the bowl game and had a split, and they lost. I think whether it was the AP, I think it was the AP, but they still won the national championship on the UPI.
Yep. Yeah, there's a bunch of national titles you can go back and look at where teams finished undefeated and then lost their bowl game and were still national titles. Some people have gone back and kind of retroactively changed those things, but that was the crazy system we had at the time. College football has always done things its own way, and it's left a lot of room for debate. That is for certain.
So finally, enough of the history lesson, which I have thoroughly enjoyed. The idea that Alabama and Michigan are playing in the Rose Bowl from a historical standpoint, what does that mean to you?
Well, I love it. I'll tell you what, it's cool because at least a Big Ten team is there and it's SEC team and it's a great matchup. But the one I was hoping for is kind of what we're talking about here. Alabama's first Rose Bowl, the 25-26, was against the University of Washington. So we've seen how they manipulate rankings to do what they want to do with them. So I was hoping they would have found a way to put Washington number 1, and then you could have put the Pacific Conference champion in the Rose Bowl, which would have been a great heritage-style move, had Alabama out, and we would have had a rematch of the 25-26 Rose Bowl, which was a magnificent game, 20-19. Alabama won. Star players all over the place. And it would have been fun to use all that history in the run-up to the game to show people what pieces of the sport we're trying to preserve as we move forward into the new playoff era, and give them a glimpse into the past and sort of why things are what they are. People might wonder, well, why is Alabama, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a football power? And you can say, well, because they won the 26 Rose Bowl and decided football meant the world to them. They advertised it in New York newspapers. They wanted out-of-state students. They said, come watch our championship football team. The South got behind it and said, hey, college football is a big deal. We should all try to be like Alabama. I mean, it led into so many things that have created the culture of the sport today. I wish they would have done that. But that said, it should be a fantastic game between Michigan and Alabama.
And the funny thing is, and I've heard this 1,000 times, the star when I was growing up in Alabama, but the star of the 25 Rose Bowl was a guy named Johnny Mack Brown, later became a famous Hollywood actor.
Johnny Mack Brown, Hollywood actor, Western star, and that was a regular thing for teams that went out to play in that Rose Bowl. L.A. was a much smaller town. Hollywood was a much smaller place. They had these good-looking college football players out there. The movie people would come down and say, come take a screen test. We want to see how you look on film. So not only Johnny Mack Brown, in 38, when Alabama went back, Paul Bear Bryant was a young assistant coach on that team. It's actually the only Rose Bowl Alabama ever lost. The Hollywood people had Bear Bryant come out for a screen test. And it didn't work out. I can't remember who did it. It might have been MGM, but he didn't quite look on camera like he looked in person, and Bryant walked away from it. His famous quote was, they asked how it went with Hollywood, and they said, well, they were trying to make silk purse out of a sow's ear, so I don't think I'm going to be in the movies.
You know, Bryant would have been quite a matinee idol. Hey, Mark, this was fantastic. Really appreciate your time.
Hey, Paul, appreciate you. I was glad to talk to you guys.
You got it. Wow, that was fun. That was literally like going back in time, and what an amazing recap there from Mark. We'll take a short break. I just looked at the time, and we didn't take a short break.